Champagne glasses were raised, executives laughing too loudly, stage lights washing everything in that false gold companies use when loyalty needs to feel festive. I stood among my team, halfway through a practiced smile, when the MC began the countdown and invited our CEO to share a few transparent words before midnight. Harold Whitcomb took the microphone like it belonged to him, confident, relaxed. A man rarely told no in rooms full of people who knew better. He spoke about momentum, agility, the future. Then he said my name. As part of our restructuring, Harold announced, voice calm and rehearsed. Leanna Mercer will no longer be with us, effective immediately. The room stalled. Silence lagged behind the sentence as people waited for a punchline that never came. I didn't move. No HR beside him, no meeting, no warning. My career ended between a toast and a countdown. My voice surprised even me. Is this how you announce accountability now? Heads turned. Harold didn't answer. He looked straight at me and added, this company needs momentum, not hesitation. Hesitation, I said evenly. That's what you call reading contracts before signing them. I wasn't a middle manager cleared out for optics. I was the senior risk and authorization director, the final signature on credit facilities, compliance attestations, institutional guarantees, the name banks asked for when numbers stopped making sense. To Harold, that made me slow. To everyone else, it kept disasters off headlines. Applause crept back, scattered and uncomfortable. Glasses clinked again. The countdown resumed, as if nothing irreversible had happened. I glanced at the large digital clock above the stage. Its numbers kept changing, indifferent to embarrassment. Only a few minutes remained before the financial year closed. Harold smiled, satisfied, unaware he had just made the most public decision of his career at the worst possible moment. Everyone else was still counting. A year is ending, and another is quietly lining up behind it. Stories like this land differently when you've carried both wins and scars into the new year. How did this moment make you feel, and where are you listening from tonight? If you want to stay with this story as it unfolds, subscribe and walk into the next chapter with me. Because what happened after that countdown changed everything. Security moved before the applause fully returned. Harold didn't look at me when he lifted 2 fingers toward the guards. They approached from either side, professional and quiet, as if escorting a guest who had overstayed her welcome. That was the moment humiliation settled into my chest. I didn't resist. Resistance would have given him satisfaction. Instead, I walked as conversations dissolved into awkward silence. People I had worked beside for years suddenly studied the floor. No one met my eyes. Near the stage, Evan Whitcomb stood close to Harold, smiling. Evan wasn't just another executive. He was Harold's nephew, recently installed, untested, and protected by blood rather than experience. His expression said the decision had been made long before tonight, as the guards guided me forward. Memories pressed in, sharp and unwanted. 14 years of signing off on decisions that saved this company from itself. 14 years of saying no when yes would have looked braver, but ended careers. I blocked reckless guarantees, delayed deals that smelled wrong, and forced executives to explain numbers they hoped no one would question. Those choices never earned applause. They earned irritation. Harold called it hesitation. I called it survival. Behind me, music swelled again. Harold was already laughing, already refilling glasses, already shaking hands. The party didn't pause for consequences. The exit doors came into view, and with them, the weight of everything I wasn't allowed to say. My jaw ached from holding composure in place. Anger burned, controlled and compressed. Waiting, just before the guards reached the doors. My phone vibrated in my hand. I didn't need to look to understand, but I did. An automated message from the bank filled the screen. Authorized signatory status pending verification. I kept walking, expression unchanged, while something cold and exact settled behind my ribs. That single line explained more than Harold ever could. He thought this was an ending. It wasn't. Outside the ballroom, the noise faded, replaced by steady breathing. Humiliation still clung to me, but it no longer felt directionless. It had found focus. Harold had chosen spectacle over process, speed over safeguards, family over structure. That choice would echo far beyond this night. I slipped my phone into my pocket and let the doors close behind me. Inside, they kept counting. Outside, I started doing the math. And math, unlike applause, always finishes the story. Outside, the night air felt neutral, almost respectful. I didn't rush. I didn't linger. Public termination is not a misunderstanding you correct later. It is a statement, delivered once, then recorded by everyone who witnessed it. I understood that clearly. There would be no walk back into that room, no quiet apology, no revised narrative in the morning. At home, I set my coat down, poured a glass of water, and opened my laptop. Habit took over, calm replaced heat. This was how I had survived for 14 years, by stepping away from emotion and into structure. If something had shifted, the answer would already exist somewhere in writing. I pulled up my employment agreement, then the addenda most executives never read twice. There it was. Continuity of authorization. A clause written years ago. Negotiated quietly after a banking audit that had nearly frozen operations. It outlined a simple rule: authorized signatories could not be altered during a financial year transition without board ratification and external verification. I read it again. Slowly, not for hope, for accuracy. Harold hadn't just removed me from the company. He had done it publicly, immediately, and without procedural cover. The clause didn't care about intent or embarrassment. It only cared about timing and authority. And timing. Tonight was everything. I followed the cross-references, confirming language with archived emails and board minutes. The structure was airtight. My termination triggered a verification requirement. Until completed, every dependent authorization paused. Quietly, automatically, no alarms, no alerts sent to executives who preferred speed over systems. I closed the laptop and sat back. There was no satisfaction yet, only clarity. This was not revenge. It was consequence. Harold believed momentum came from removing resistance. He never understood that resistance sometimes held the frame together. By forcing an immediate exit, he had removed the final authorized link without installing a lawful replacement. The chain didn't snap. It simply disengaged. I checked my phone once more. No messages from the company, no frantic calls. That would come later. Systems move slower than egos, but they move with certainty. I turned off the light and let the quiet settle. The decision had already been made for him. All I had done was step aside and allow the rules he ignored to begin working. Tomorrow, the silence would start asking questions. And this time, no microphone would soften the answers. They would arrive methodically, legally, and without drama. Exactly as systems respond when arrogance outruns governance fails publicly. Observant viewers will notice something unusual here. What about you? I woke the next morning with a stillness that felt earned, not forced, overnight. The story had moved beyond embarrassment and into process, where feelings stopped mattering. By the time coffee finished brewing, the first notification arrived. A standard banking alert, neutral in tone, precise in wording, disbursement pending review. I didn't smile. Suspense rarely announces itself loudly. It prefers polite delays. Across town, Harold Whitcomb was already shouting. I knew the pattern well enough to picture it without being there. HR first, then legal, then anyone who couldn't answer him fast enough. Problems. To him, were always people. Systems were supposed to obey. By mid-morning, a second message followed. Credit guarantees remained unconfirmed. No rejection, just suspension. The kind that forces meetings instead of apologies. I imagined Harold pacing, phone pressed to his ear, demanding explanations that didn't exist. Someone must have suggested Evan sign in my place. The thought landed with a dull inevitability. Evan had the confidence of inheritance and none of the credentials. He could copy my signature, but authority doesn't transfer through proximity or blood. It transfers through approval, documentation, and time. He signed anyway. That single action didn't break anything. It simply failed to fix what Harold had already disrupted. Unauthorized signatures don't trigger alarms. They trigger reviews. Late afternoon. My phone vibrated again. This time, it wasn't automated. A banker I'd worked with for years left a careful voicemail. Every word measured. They were seeking confirmation. Until then, funds would remain untouched. Harold must have been furious by then. Furious enough to call lawyers. Furious enough to threaten consequences. Furious enough to realize too late that volume doesn't override procedure. He had removed the person designed to answer these questions and replaced her with silence. The email followed minutes later, copied to multiple departments. One sentence stood out. Clean and impossible to misread. We need Mercer's authorization or the previous board approved equivalent. I read it twice. Not for reassurance, but for completeness. The system had responded exactly as written. No drama, no accusations, just requirements. The crack wasn't loud, it was controlled. A pause where momentum was supposed to be. Harold had wanted speed. What he created was friction. I set my phone down and watched the morning light fade into evening. This wasn't collapse, it was alignment. And once systems begin aligning against you, they do not stop because someone raises their voice. They continue, step by step, until reality replaces confidence and consequences replace assumptions. That night, nothing exploded, no headlines, no apologies, just a quiet resistance forming inside the framework he ignored. I knew then the company would feel this delay everywhere it mattered. Systems remember timing, and timing, once violated, does not forgive. It was only the first response. But it confirmed everything I needed to know already tonight. The meeting happened without ceremony, which felt appropriate. Justice rarely announces itself. It circulates quietly through memos, calendar invites, and legal language that leaves no room for performance. I wasn't in the room, but I didn't need to be. I knew exactly how it would unfold. The internal counsel began with facts, not feelings. The termination was executed publicly, she said. It occurred during a financial transition window. No accusation, just record. Then came the second point. Sharper and more dangerous. The authorized signatory was replaced without procedural clearance. Silence followed. Not confusion, recognition. I imagined Harold sitting back in his chair, arms crossed, waiting for someone to defend his decision. No one did. Lawyers don't protect pride. They protect institutions. The counsel continued, laying out timelines, clauses, and verification failures. Each sentence tightened the frame he had stepped outside of. One board member finally asked, "Are we exposed?" The answer came clean and unemotional. Until authorization continuity is restored, decision authority is compromised. Compromised, not dramatic, fatal in its own way. The resolution didn't sound like punishment. It sounded like housekeeping. A temporary suspension of executive signing authority, narrow in scope, immediate in effect. Harold would remain CEO. He would keep the title, the office, the visibility. What he lost was motion. Someone asked if this was necessary. The response was calm. It's required. When Harold spoke, it wasn't with anger, it was disbelief. So I can't sign anything, not at this time, the counsel replied. Power doesn't disappear all at once. It drains, quietly. Through channels people forget exist until they're blocked. I found out through a message forwarded without commentary. No one congratulated me. No one apologized. There was nothing to say. The system had responded exactly as designed. Later that evening, Harold called me, not to argue, to understand. His voice sounded smaller than I remembered. How much damage can one employee really cause? I didn't answer right away. The question assumed intent. This had never been about damage. It isn't about one employee, I said finally. It's about removing the wrong one at the wrong time. He didn't respond. I ended the call and sat with the quiet satisfaction that comes when rules work without needing permission. There was no victory speech, no confrontation, just an executive with a title and no authority, learning the difference between leadership and leverage. Justice didn't raise its voice. It didn't need to. It had already been signed into place long before Harold decided to perform. If you see anything unusual here, comment, I see it. The phone rang late in the afternoon, long after the shouting had stopped and the emails had settled into careful language. I recognized the number immediately. Harold Whitcomb never called unless he believed he still controlled the conversation. His voice was different, not softer exactly, but stripped of performance. Leanna, he said, as if saying my name correctly might fix something already broken. I didn't interrupt. Silence had become my advantage. We're going through a complicated phase. He continued. Temporary friction. You understand how these things work. No accusation, no command, just an attempt to normalize panic. I let him speak. He needed the space. We need your help, Harold finally said. Just until things stabilize. Come back as a consultant, quietly, help the company get through this. There it was. Not an apology, a transaction. He wasn't asking me to return. He was asking me to erase the consequences of his decision without acknowledging it had been one. You fired me publicly, I said, evenly. That wasn't a mistake. That was a decision. The line stayed between us, heavy and precise. I imagined him gripping the phone, searching for a way around it. That doesn't mean we can't be practical, he replied. We don't have time for principles right now. That was always his tell. When urgency appeared, accountability disappeared. I was practical for 14 years, I said. You called it hesitation. A pause followed. Not static. Calculation. If you come back, Harold tried again. We can fix this. No one needs to know. I know, I said. And so do the systems you ignored. His breathing sharpened. Power doesn't like hearing its limits described calmly. You're really going to let this escalate, he asked. I'm not escalating anything, I replied. I'm staying exactly where you put me. He didn't argue after that. He couldn't. The leverage had shifted, and he felt it. Titles mean very little when authority no longer listens. I'll be clear, I said before ending the call. I'm not coming back. The line went dead. I set the phone down and felt the tension drain, replaced by a controlled certainty. This wasn't defiance. It was alignment. Harold had removed the one person designed to slow him down. Now he was discovering what speed looks like without brakes. Outside. The day moved on. Indifferent. Inside the company. Everything waited. Decisions paused. Signatures stalled. Meetings multiplied without resolution. I didn't need to intervene. Refusal was enough. Sometimes power doesn't change hands through action. Sometimes it changes because someone steps away and lets the structure reveal who was holding it together all along. Evan Whitcomb was summoned before noon, dragged into a room he had never earned access to. The meeting wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. Panic has a way of lowering voices. I wasn't there, but the details traveled quickly. Harold sat at the head of the table, silent for once, while Evan tried to explain what he couldn't define. I signed where they told me to, Evan said, defensive and confused. No one answered. The questions came slowly. Which certifications did he hold? Which authorizations covered his role? Who had approved his substitution? Evan had answers for none of it. He had a last name, not credentials. Confidence, not clearance. Someone slid a document across the table. An audit summary, freshly printed. 2 phrases were underlined. Unauthorized execution. Nepotistic risk escalation. They weren't accusations. They were classifications. Evan stared at the page as if it might change. I was helping, he insisted. My uncle needed someone. That was the problem. Helping without authority isn't help, it's exposure. The auditors didn't argue. They explained. By signing without board approval, Evan had created a traceable breach. Every decision he touched now required review. Every signature became evidence. The faster Harold had tried to replace me, the clearer the trail became. Harold finally spoke. This is being blown out of proportion. One of the auditors replied calmly. No, this is being documented. That distinction mattered. By the end of the meeting, Evan was no longer a solution. He was a liability with a timestamp. His name appeared in reports sent to shareholders, banks, and regulators. Not as a villain, as proof. I read the summary that evening. Dry language, precise conclusions. Evan Whitcomb had been elevated without qualification, empowered without authorization, and allowed to execute decisions beyond his scope. Nepotism wasn't implied. It was recorded. The irony settled in slowly. Harold had fired me publicly to project control. What he exposed instead was governance failure he could no longer contain. Evan didn't lose his job that day. He lost his protection. That was worse. I closed the report and leaned back, letting the bitterness fade into something sharper. Systems don't care about family. They care about process. And once process begins correcting itself, it doesn't stop for embarrassment. Evan had walked into that meeting as a successor. He walked out as evidence, and that evidence would travel farther than any apology Harold could offer. I imagined Evan explaining himself later, telling friends it happened too fast to learn the rules. That excuse would age poorly. Reports circulate, records remain. Boards remember names attached to mistakes. The company would spend months unwinding signatures he placed too confidently. Harold's shortcut had created a permanent paper trail, and paper never forgets. Evan would discover that being chosen is not the same as being qualified, and that nepotism doesn't protect you once governance turns factual. This lesson, delivered publicly and permanently, would define Evan's career long after the party ended and the music stopped for everyone involved. When consequences arrive, they rarely ask permission. They move through calendars, inboxes, and contracts, dismantling confidence piece by piece. By the end of the week, the company no longer spoke about momentum. It spoke about exposure. Partners were the first to step back, meetings postponed, then canceled. Emails shifted from optimism to caution, one by one. Counterparties invoked clauses they had always kept ready. Risk committees froze commitments, citing governance uncertainty. No one accused. They simply withdrew. Shareholders followed. Emergency calls replaced earnings forecasts. Questions sharpened. Why was authority suspended? Who approved the replacement? Why had safeguards failed? Harold could not answer without admitting how quickly he had traded structure for control. The press noticed next. Headlines appeared without commentary, precise and unforgiving. Leadership suspended amid governance failure. No adjectives, no speculation, just a statement that traveled farther than any apology could. The company's name trended beside words it had spent decades avoiding. Inside the building, silence returned. Heavier this time. Executives lowered their voices. Legal teams rewrote timelines. Every decision now required confirmation, review, and documentation. The system was correcting itself, and it did not care who felt embarrassed along the way. Harold's removal came quietly, not a firing. A request framed as necessity. The board cited stability, fiduciary duty, and confidence restoration. He cleared his office without spectacle, still holding the title in his email signature for hours after it stopped meaning anything. I learned of it through a message forwarded by a colleague. No satisfaction rushed in, only recognition. This was what accountability looked like when it finally caught up. Then came the calls. Board members this time. Different tone. Careful. Respectful. They spoke about continuity, about restoring trust, about needing experience. One of them said my name the way people do when they are asking for rescue. They didn't apologize. They didn't explain. They implied return. I listened, then declined. Not dramatically, not angrily, simply clearly. The system had already answered the question they were asking. When I ended the call, I understood the final irony. Harold had fallen because he believed control was personal. The board still believed recovery was too. They were wrong. Systems don't need saving. They need respect. And once they begin enforcing that truth, they don't reverse course because someone hopes the right person will come back and fix what should never have been broken in the first place. I walked away, knowing satisfaction did not come from watching a man fall, but from seeing order restored. The punishment was not dramatic. It was structural, methodical, and deserved. Somewhere inside those offices, policies would be reread, names double-checked, and authority treated with caution again. That was enough. Justice had arrived without noise, and it would remain long after faces changed. It would shape behavior quietly, teaching leaders that systems outlast egos, reputations, titles, excuses, shortcuts, arrogance, and impulsive authority forever. I received the invitation without surprise. Only timing. The board wanted a meeting, urgent but respectful, framed as reconciliation rather than correction. When I entered the room, every seat was filled, faces serious, voices measured. Power had learned to whisper. They spoke first about trust, about stability, about restoring confidence across partners, regulators, and shareholders. Then they spoke about me, my experience, my history, my irreplaceable understanding of authorization continuity. It was strange hearing my value described only after it was publicly dismissed. The offer was generous. Expanded authority, direct reporting lines, language carefully chosen to sound like progress instead of retreat. They called it leadership renewal. I heard remediation. One director leaned forward. "We need you back," he said, "to finish what you started." I let the silence stretch. I wanted them to feel how decisions echo when no one rushes to soften them. "I don't fix systems that reward public humiliation," I said. The words didn't shake. They didn't need to. The room shifted. This wasn't the response they'd prepared for. Another director tried a different angle, softer this time. "This isn't about the past," she said. "It's about restoring function." "That is the past," I replied. "Function depends on how people are treated when it's inconvenient to respect them." They offered compromises, advisory roles, temporary authority, quiet re-entry. Each proposal assumed my signature was a tool they could reinsert once consequences became uncomfortable. I explained calmly what had already been documented. Authorization continuity was broken. Restoration required lawful sequence, timing, and consent. Without my participation, some contracts could be renegotiated, others could not. Certain guarantees would remain suspended permanently. One voice asked, carefully, "Are you saying this can't be fully fixed? I'm saying it can't be undone." I answered. That was the moment realization replaced negotiation. They weren't inviting me back to lead. They were asking me to reverse gravity. I stood, thanked them for the clarity, and declined again. Not out of anger, out of principle. Dignity doesn't negotiate after it's been tested publicly and found disposable. As I left, I felt something release. The tension that had carried me since the countdown finally loosened. Refusal wasn't loss. It was completion. Later. The updates came, partial recoveries, revised projections, permanent gaps where my authorization had once anchored certainty. The system adapted, but it would never look the same. That was the final lesson. Power assumes people are interchangeable. Systems remember who was removed, when, and why. And sometimes, the most decisive action is choosing not to return, letting structure record the truth without interference. It clarified my role in the story I hadn't chosen, but had finished. I wasn't walking away empty. I was walking away intact. The company would survive, altered and cautious. I would move forward, unchanged in principle. Some consequences arrive loudly, others arrive clean, contractual, and permanent. This one would live in footnotes, audits, and future boardrooms, quietly warning the next leader who mistook authority for entitlement and assumed humiliation was an acceptable management tool. That lesson would not fade quickly, and it would never require my presence again after that night. I didn't announce my next step. It arrived naturally, without urgency or spectacle. Within months, I was working independently. Advising boards that understood governance was not decoration, but architecture. Independent governance advisor sounded clinical, but the work was precise. I evaluated authorization chains, stress-tested compliance, and asked the questions executives preferred not to hear. They paid for clarity, not comfort. Harold Whitcomb faded quickly. His name stopped appearing on panels, then in filings, then in conversation. No press release explained it. The industry simply moved on. As it always does when confidence dissolves, leadership is remembered only while it functions. Once it fails, silence replaces reputation. What remained was quieter and more durable. Policies were rewritten, signatures were double-checked, committees slowed their calendars. I saw the effects everywhere, small corrections accumulating into discipline. No one mentioned me publicly, but my absence had become a reference point. It reminded them what happens when procedure is treated as inconvenience. I didn't feel victorious. I felt finished. Justice, I learned, is rarely emotional at the end. It settles like dust after construction, revealing a structure that can finally stand on its own. The company survived, altered but wiser. Others noticed. They adjusted before learning the same lesson the hard way. My work continued, measured and deliberate. I chose assignments carefully, favoring institutions willing to listen before crisis forced them to. That was the difference now. I no longer had to defend caution. It was requested, with distance. I understood peace was not forgetting, but integration, carrying experience forward without bitterness. Each engagement reaffirmed that restraint has weight. That law endures longer than charisma, and that my silence that night created a louder correction than any speech could have delivered during periods of institutional stress and leadership transition. Looking back, the moment that changed everything wasn't the firing or the calls that followed. It was the refusal to return. Walking away allowed the system to record the truth without interruption. That record mattered more than any confrontation ever could. Power doesn't collapse loudly. It collapses when it forgets who keeps it legal. Looking back, the real lesson wasn't about revenge or winning. It was about what happens when you choose dignity over noise. I learned that power isn't proven by how loudly you respond, but by how firmly you stand when everything pushes you to explain yourself. Walking away with your values intact hurts in the moment, but it heals you in the long run. That kind of strength doesn't fade, it settles in and stays. If you're still here with me, did you listen all the way to the end, as one year closes and a new one begins? I truly hope the next chapter brings you peace, clarity, and the courage to trust yourself. Where are you listening from right now if this story made you feel seen? Leave a comment and share your thoughts. A like or a share helps these stories reach the people who need them most. And if you want to keep walking through stories like this together, consider subscribing. I'm glad you're here.